Hello and welcome to our webinar, Biden and Belarus, a New Strategy. The webinar is organized by the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. My name is Katya Glod, I am a CEPA Fellow, and I will moderate today's discussion. Briefly, some housekeeping rules. Our discussion will run for approximately 1 hour, and it will be held on the record. Please ask your questions in the Q&A box that you will see on your left. We will begin with 4 short presentations by our speakers, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. And I would encourage you to type in your question early so that there is enough time to ask it. Without further ado, please, I would like to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. Today from Vilnius, we are joined by Tatsiana Chulitskaya. Tatsiana is a researcher with Vytautas Magnus University. From Berlin, we are joined by Valery Kovalevsky. Valery is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's representative on foreign affairs. Next, from Miami, we are joined by David J. Kramer, who is Director of European and Eurasian Studies and also Senior Fellow with Václav Havel Program on Human Rights and Diplomacy at Florida International University. And last but not least, from London, we are joined today by Ian Bond, who is Director of Foreign Policy at the Center for European Reform. So the 9th of March marked 8 months of Belarus struggle for freedom and democracy. Cold weather and extreme repression by the regime have reduced the scale of protest. However, civil society continues to self-organize and vehemently rejects the violent and repressive policy of the regime. What should the US and Europe do? How should they respond to the crackdown by Lukashenko's regime? How can they force transatlantic engagement on Belarus? And perhaps even more importantly, how can they best support democracy building efforts in Belarus? Let me turn to our first speaker, who is Tatsiana Chulitskaya. And Tatsiana, repression in Belarus currently in high gear. The latest report by Freedom House has put Belarus on a par with Yemen and the Gaza Strip. While we have seen courts handing down heavy prison sentences, we have seen people being fired who had been spotted protesting. We have also seen a whole range of new repressive legislative amendments, and we know that more are coming of this. And of course, private business is also under attack. Under these circumstances, how can civil society self-organize? Last year, we saw this unprecedented mobilization, grassroots efforts to build local communities, to set up professional organizations, genuine trade unions, indeed independent of the state. But are these efforts actually sustainable under the current repression in Belarus today? Please, Tatsiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me and for inviting me. I will briefly describe the current political situation in Belarus and also the needs of civil society. As Katya has already mentioned, the protest in Belarus lasted till approximately the end of November, mass protests, when they were suspended because of the severe repressions, cold weather, and other reasons. However, as the opinion polls demonstrate, the dissatisfaction of Belarusians with the current leadership have not disappeared. Acts of civil disobedience in the country happen every day. The oppositional leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is forced to leave the country. She and newly established oppositional structures, including the Coordination Council, are acting predominantly from abroad. However, some activists are still inside the country, and the majority of political oppositional leaders, including Viktor Babarika, Sergei Tikhanovsky, Maria Kolesnikova, and others, are still in prison. Also, Babarika still preserves the highest positions in the ranking of popular politicians. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has got an international legitimacy and conduct active foreign policy with the goal to provide conditions for the new democratic elections in the country. However, we understand all the limitations for the mobilization of the people inside the country from abroad. In general, when we are speaking about this political crisis in Belarus, I would like to mention that it was caused by the changed political views of the Belarusians themselves, the majority of whom supported the idea of democratic changes. There was a breakdown of the previously existed in the country social contract, which was based on a deliberate refusal of Belarusians to take part in political activities for the sake of relatively stable level of social welfare provided by a big paternalistic state. Failure of Lukashenko's government to address COVID-19 challenges provoked growth of new grassroots initiatives in the country. And the latter strengthened the horizontal networks and previously non-widespread solidarity practices in Belarusian society. In parallel, the spread of communication technologies and the growth of internet usage in the country facilitated the protest mobilization. However, this awakening of civil society caused a harsh reaction of the Belarusian authoritarian government, and today we witness an unprecedented level of repressions. Lukashenko seeks not just to stay in power by all means, but also to eliminate the very possibility of political participation for democratic leaders and ordinary citizens. Just to mention briefly the main pillars of support which Lukashenko still preserves, in my opinion. The first pillar is military, secret service, and other coercive institutions, we might call them siloviki, who have always been provided with a generous support from the Belarusian government. And in spite of the cases when some officers left the positions in these structures, this pillar seems to be quite stable up till now. The second pillar of Lukashenko's support is bureaucracy and state apparatus, and we assume a certain split within this government, with especially pro-liberal economic part of the government who might be more pro-democratic. However, there is this anti-democratic Siloviki part who seem to be still totally supportive towards Lukashenko. And the last pillar are so-called co-supporters of Lukashenko who either uncritically trust him or support him because of their pragmatic reasons. And here I should mention, for instance, some pro-Lukashenko businessmen. And external support, as we also know, of Lukashenko is provided by Russia. Also, I should mention that Kremlin and Lukashenko relations are far from cloudless today. When it comes to civil society, after August 2020, many newcomers initiatives and new types of civil society initiatives mushroomed in the country. However, we see the repressions against this old and new civil society today, and we also observe a serious deterioration of financial conditions for civil society organization in the country. So it's basically difficult to get any support either from abroad or from inside the country, and there is no opportunities for to get funding from the state. So summing up, I would say that we observe a deep political crisis inside the country. We may also say that conditions for the civil society activities have significantly deteriorated, and there are a lot of arrests of civic activists and political oppositional leaders, and also we see all the challenges for political oppositions to act from abroad. And the last point I would like to mention here is that many civil society organizations today are also forced to act from abroad. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to cover the issue of recommendations, but maybe I will have some time during our discussions on recommendations if you allow me later on.
Yes, Tatsiana, thank you very much. I think we'll move on to the recommendations later. I'm sure there will be questions from our audience. But now let me move on to our next speaker, who is Valery Kovalevsky. And again, Valery is representative, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's representative on foreign affairs. Valery, could you tell us a little bit about the opposition's plans? Last month, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya published a new strategy, the so-called victory strategy, where she calls for a new wave of protests this spring. And the opposition, you hope that you might be able to negotiate with the regime sometime in May. And may I just ask you very bluntly, Valery, here, how are you going to achieve this? What if, which seems to be very likely the case, the regime just refuses to talk to you? Please, Valery, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katya, and thank you, CEPA, for arranging this event. Thank you, panelists, for being part of the discussion, and thank you for the blunt questions. This is much appreciated to talk business. And to Tatsiana, thank you for laying the groundwork for the discussion. This is the most crucial element of of the whole movement, like what's going on in Belarus, like whether the people are prepared to protest, if they're willing to continue demanding the change in the country. Because this is one of the crucial elements of the strategy of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya that was just released. And this strategy is not only for the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, for her as the leader of democratic Belarus, but also for other structures of the democratic movement. We prefer not to call ourselves opposition because we are convinced that we are the majority in the country. But this also entails participation of national anti-crisis management in Warsaw. This is also a coordination council based in Minsk mostly. And various initiatives run by athletes, by people working in the cultural sphere, doctors, medical professionals, former police officers, all of them kind of work in the same direction, sort of within the framework of this strategy. So there are two pressures, and naturally, the most important one is internal pressure that is sort of exercised by people through the protest movement, through their resistance, through their kind of unwillingness to accept Lukashenko as a legitimate leader of Belarus. For the external pressure, these are our activities engaging with national governments, with international organizations, and both these types of pressures, they are actually very much interconnected. For Belarusians, it's very much important to see that they are not abandoned, that they're not alone in this struggle, that all this enthusiasm, empathy that we see abroad, it is actually converted into practical steps. That the government are doing real steps in order to put pressure on Lukashenko. So we're very much under pressure as sort of political structures of the movement, protest movement, sort of to show the real achievements, like what actually we have achieved in order to help Belarusians inside the country to continue protesting. Meanwhile, it is very important for foreign governments, especially for national governments, to see that the protest is still continuing, that it has not subsided, it has not stopped kind of eventually. Therefore, kind of we have to work in both areas, both internal protest, internal pressure, and external pressures. They are interconnected and need to be kind of worked on jointly. So as for the tasks within the strategy, there are two main tasks. One is to deprive Lukashenko of the resources, and the other one is to split the elites around him. So for both of these tasks within our efforts to exercise internal pressure to build it up, we have developed and are implementing a new communication strategy. Kind of two main recipients of these communications would be law enforcement and public service. And of course, we continue working with grassroots initiatives within the country, and kind of with the activists that sort of compose the core of the protest. As far as the communication strategy with law enforcement concerned, we have studied the fears, the concerns, the sentiment within the law enforcement community in Belarus. And we came to a conclusion quite unexpectedly that law enforcement are actually the least protected people in Belarus. They're being heavily used by the regime. They are forced essentially to do the work they don't have to do. They're supposed to protect law and order. Instead, they have to protect political interests of one person. They're deprived of their reputation. Their reputation is tarnished in the eyes of the society. They experience this serious backlash from people they live among. And sometimes, not sometimes, but the reality is that only a small portion of people who are part of the law enforcement, they were involved in these severe, grave crimes against protesters. But the entire law enforcement force, they actually experience the backlash from the society. So we want to communicate to them as well as to the public officials within the administration, is that when the change comes, their interest will not be ignored. These people will never become unnecessary people to the new Belarus. Their social benefits, their payments, their subsidies for housing, they will be retained. They don't have to be afraid of the uncertainty in the future. So in such a way, we are trying to communicate to them that the change is positive to them, that the present, which is very negative and very depressing to them, can be replaced by the future, which is brighter. For this, they need to reduce the level of violence. They should not intimidate protesters any longer. So in such a way, we are preparing the groundwork for protests to be less violent, from the law enforcement. We have also established the tactical headquarters by Paul, which would be run by this initiative of former policemen from Belarus, by Paul, to monitor, to coordinate, and to protect people who involve in protests. It has to be mentioned that this initiative is non-political. It will be run only by the specialists of BIPOL, by technical specialists, but not by politicians. So now turning to external pressure, which is very vast. It is less tangible sometimes, but also very important, again, to feed the sentiment and confidence of the internal pressure. So we aim at several directions, working with national governments and international organizations. We need to strengthen the political isolation for Lukashenko and his regime. We need to cut financial flows into the country, be it direct investments or be it funding for specific governmental programs by international organizations or by national governments. And we want European Union and United States, Canada and UK to impose sanctions on Lukashenko. And there are probably 4 groups of such sanctions. First would be the wallets of the regime. These are the people who support Lukashenko financially, who sort of form the core around him that helps him to stay resilient, helps him to kind of withstand the pressure, financial and political pressure. But also these people benefiting directly from being loyal to Lukashenko. They maintain monopolistic positions within Belarusian economy. They have preferences that would be unmatched by anybody else. So these people will have to be targeted by sanctions. There will be select enterprises, and some of them have already been under American sanctions. These 9 enterprises are currently under waiver, but this waiver is set to expire at the end of April, and we expect that the United States will decide to let this waiver expire, and the sanctions will resume as a result. This will also help European Union to join probably this effort of the United States. It will be much easier, kind of psychologically, for European Union countries to join sanctions already implemented by the United States. The other would be to probably introduce a ban on supplies of gear, equipment, and munition for law enforcement of Belarus. Finally, important element of this strategy is to make sure that Russia is deterred from strengthening control over Belarus, while also engaging it in a constructive conversation with other actors on resolving the crisis in Belarus. So in sum, all these measures are supposed to build up sufficient pressure on Lukashenko to force him to stop the violence, release political prisoners, and start the dialogue leading to the elections in Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valery. You gave us a lot of food for thought. You've covered quite a lot, and I'm sure there will be many questions from our audience because you've touched on a whole range of issues. Well, thank you again. May I now turn to you, David? And you have been following Belarus for at least since the early 2000s, and I think probably earlier than that. Well, what leverage does the US have on the Lukashenko regime? Is it only sanctions? And again, talking about sanctions, I think people in Belarus feel a little bit frustrated that the current sanctions are actually weaker than those we saw in the past. And in the case of the US, for example, the US introduced economic sanctions on 9 state-owned companies back in 2006. And I think Valery mentioned that exactly these sanctions that are currently suspended. Why are we not seeing that level of sanctions today? But also, obviously, looking beyond the sanctions, David, how should the new administration engage with civil society and the political opposition in Belarus? The floor is yours, David, please.
Great, Katya, thanks so much. And thanks to you and Geisha and Alina and CEPA for organizing this and for putting together a great panel. I'm honored to be with my colleagues and friends here. The situation, I think, is one where we are in transition, obviously, in the United States still. On the one hand, it is already March, but on the other hand, it's only March. And the Biden administration does not yet have its full team in place, either at the State Department, which obviously takes the lead in foreign policy, but also at the Treasury Department, which plays a critical role when it comes to the implementation and imposition of financial sanctions on freezing assets. And so my hope is that as the new team gets fully in place, we will see more aggressive steps being taken by the United States. Still, we have George Kent, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary at State, who's done a great job. The previous Deputy Secretary of State, Steve Biegun, and he traveled to the region, including to Moscow in September, and I give both of them credit for their efforts. Of course, we also have Julie Fisher, who has been confirmed by the US Senate to be the new ambassador to Belarus, and she made her first trip in that capacity to Vilnius to meet with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya and also to Warsaw and Stockholm. Exactly the right step to take, so I give her and the administration credit for planning her initial activities that way. And if she gets a visa and is able to go to Minsk, she should make sure not to present her credentials to anyone in the current regime. That would risk legitimizing the current regime. But I think having a US ambassador return, I was in the government and the State Department at the time when Belarus kicked out our ambassador in 2008, Karen Stewart. I do think it is time for a US ambassador to go back, not to legitimize the regime, of course, but to show solidarity with the incredibly brave people of Belarus who are turning out in the streets against tremendous risks. And to show that the United States is an important player in this, together with the European Union and Canada, Australia, and others. But the United States has a very important role to play, and I expect it will. It's also important, I think, that we learn from our mistakes in the past. And that is, we had a tendency to get tough on Lukashenko and then to ease up based on hollow promises that he made or release of political prisoners. And I'm not downplaying getting people out of prison. That's incredibly important, having met some of them and known some of them over the years. But we then fell into a trap where Lukashenko would play the West and Russia off of each other, and we would then buddy up to Lukashenko, including just a little over a year ago when then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made a terribly poorly timed visit to Minsk and is seen in videos smiling, yucking it up with Lukashenko. That was a terrible idea for him to go. And I hope a Secretary of State or anyone at any official level never goes to Minsk and shakes hands with Lukashenko again. We have to realize that as long as Lukashenko is in power, there is no hope for Belarus to become a democratic country. With Lukashenko out of power, there's no guarantee that Belarus will become a democratic country, but for the first time in over 26 years, there'll be a hope that Belarus can be a democratic country. And that is, I think, the key issue that should be driving Western policy, recognition that as long as Lukashenko stays in power, every day he stays there, the situation will only get worse. We have to recognize that his ability to stay in power relies solely on the use of force. He has no support. He lost the election last August, even though he controlled virtually all the means to conduct the election, and he still lost, and yet tried to steal the election. And the people of Belarus simply said, enough is enough. So I hope that we, as Valery said, in talking about the sanctions, I agree with everything he said about the various sanctions. We do need to tighten the sanctions. There were, I think it was 43 people added to the visa list in mid-February by the State Department. I don't imagine most of those people were planning to come to the United States in the first place, but it was an important step nonetheless, and I hope that will be followed by more steps down the road. As Valery said, we need to go after the money people, the people who are enabling Lukashenko to stay in power. Those include Russians, those include some Belarusians as well. They also include people in the Middle East, particularly in the UAE, who are providing Lukashenko with support, financial and otherwise. We need to, as Valery said, shut down the weapons and arms that have been provided to the Lukashenko regime. Vlad Kovats from ESUNS and I wrote a piece last week describing Russian weapons that have been used by Belarus security forces against their own people in violation of Belarus's own laws. And that needs to be tightened as well. Going after the enablers is critical. I'll wrap up, Katya, because I know we want to get to Ian and questions, but you also asked about support for democratic forces. And I agree with Valery, we should not be talking about the opposition anymore. We should be talking about democratic forces who should be, frankly, in charge right now or leading a transition to a new election. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is the legitimate, duly elected leader, in my view, and we should treat her accordingly until there are new elections. Support for civil society is critical. Support for BIPOL. I think BIPOL has done amazing work in exposing the abuses of the current regime. And of course, coordinating with the EU and the international community. I have to say, and I never thought I'd say this because I've been a longtime critic of the International Olympic Committee, but I give them credit for refusing to recognize Viktor Lukashenko, the eldest son of Aliaksandr Lukashenko, as the new chair of Belarus's National Olympic Committee. Good for them. A small step, but an important one. Every little bit helps in delegitimizing an utterly illegitimate person who refuses to step down and do what's good for his country. A documentary came out yesterday, I believe it was, on YouTube published by Nexta, exposing all the corruption and stealing from the people of Belarus that Lukashenko has engaged in, all the expensive cars and villas and other things, exposing him for what he is. A corrupt dictatorial leader who is utterly illegitimate and who needs to go. I think all of those things are worthy of Western support. Lastly, make no decisions about Belarus without Belarus. That the movement in Belarus is not about joining the EU or NATO. It's not about closer relations with Russia. It's about Belarus. And we should recognize that the people in that country have had enough, but we should not at the same time be taking any issues off the table, particularly issues that aren't on the table right now. Let the people of Belarus, when they have the ability to choose their own future, have every option available, whether it's closer relations with Russia or not. And closer relations with Russia, I would say, are looking harder and harder as the Putin regime, while not sending tanks across the border to support Lukashenko, continue to prop him up financially by sending TV presenters to fill in for Belarus TV presenters who left, by these weapons that have been used against the people. Putin risks turning the people of Belarus who have not been anti-Russian, anti-Putin, into that very phenomenon. And so I think we need to send very clear signals to Moscow that any interference or any overt moves into Belarus, or even continued support to prop him up, will be met with some decisive measures from the international community. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you for touching on those very, very important points about learning from our mistakes and changing the policy according, and also about not recognizing Lukashenko as the president of the country anymore. And I read your excellent analysis together with Vlad Kobets, and I encourage everyone to look at the foreign policy and read this investigation, which was undertaken together with Bipolar. It's shocking about what Russian weapons were actually used during the Belarusian protesters. Thank you, David, again. And let me now please move to Ian. Ian, I would like to ask you a question concerning the UK, because you're sitting in London, the European Union, and just in general, the questions about the transatlantic cooperation. Well, the UK has actually taken quite a close interest in the situation in Belarus. British media have been covering the events in Belarus in depth. The UK was quite swift to impose sanctions. To what extent would it be possible, do you think, and indeed desirable, if all three transatlantic partners, the UK, the European Union, and the US, work together in Belarus? And do you think that with the new administration in the White House, and particularly with the President Joe Biden's personal commitment to human rights, democracy, and more importantly, to working together with international partners, European partners, we might see a change in the approach from the last year? Please, Ian, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Katya. And I think this is a very timely discussion. I must admit that David has made my job quite hard, because he said quite a lot of the things that I was going to say. But maybe that gives me a little more space to answer your question to some extent. I mean, I think it's highly desirable that the EU, the UK, and the US should coordinate on this. I worry that with the position the British government is taking on any sort of institutional cooperation or contact with the EU as an institution, it's going to be really difficult to achieve that. The UK is very focused on bilateral or plurilateral relations with particularly France and Germany. And I think it's in danger of neglecting the fact that it's the EU which actually has some of the important instruments. Anyway, we'll see whether we can overcome that, but I am concerned about that. And I think next week we should see the publication of the UK's integrated review of security and defence, and that will give us some idea of whether in fact the British government is prepared to contemplate a more structured relationship with the EU as an organisation, or whether it is going to try to sort of go around the EU and to work with individual member states instead. Yeah, I mean, I first started dealing with Belarus as a policy issue in Eastern Department in the Foreign Office in 1997, not long after Lukashenko first fell foul of the EU when he rigged a referendum, overturned the original post-Soviet Belarusian constitution, and dissolved or attempted to dissolve the Supreme Soviet. And I agree with David. I mean, since then, what we have seen is that the EU and the US have imposed sanctions, amended sanctions, lifted sanctions, reimposed sanctions. And 24 years later, Lukashenko is still in power. So we've got 24 years of policy failure. And I suppose my question is, well, you know, what have we learned from the last 24 years that would ensure that we can avoid perpetuating those failures? Perhaps the most important lesson is that we can't want change more than the Belarusian people do, but we shouldn't want it less. For most of the last 2 decades, I think, despite some very brave individuals and some good organizations, we sort of had the sense that the majority of the population in Belarus was prepared to tolerate Lukashenko's dictatorship. There was no mass support for opposition. The demonstrations last year were a real eye-opener, I think, for many people. And what we have to see now is whether after the kind of winter break, that same level of enthusiasm can be generated again. That I think is very important. If it can, then I think that makes it easier for Western countries and organizations to support the Belarusian people with confidence that they're supporting a mass movement. The EU last year set out some good programs, I feel, some more support for civil society, more support for Belarusians to study, for example, at the European Humanities University in Lithuania. And all of those programs need to be implemented at speed and with a real political impulse behind them. I mean, the risk with EU programs is always that they get bogged down, that they move very slowly, that it takes a long time to identify suitable projects for support. I think the EU needs to take a bit more risk in order to act in a way which is timely to back up what's happening in terms of the resistance to Lukashenko. And I hope that the UK will coordinate its assistance with the EU. One area that I would really like to see Western governments and organizations helping civil society and Belarusian media organizations is in collecting evidence against perpetrators of repression. I think one has to create the basis for future accountability for the brutality that we've seen. A second lesson, which in some ways is related to the first, and again, also links closely to what David was saying, is that we need to be respectful of the kind of change that Belarusians want. I saw an article recently suggesting that the West should not back Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya because she didn't want to join the EU or NATO. And that seems to me to be a very bad argument. It's in the West's interests for Belarus to be ruled democratically and to have a government that respects human rights. But that's true regardless of what its foreign policy orientation is. Now, I don't see how in practice a democratic Belarus would be likely to align with an authoritarian Russia, but ultimately that's a choice for Belarusians themselves to make. Of course, if they do choose to turn towards the West, to look towards greater European integration, I'd welcome that and I'd want us to support that fully. But I don't think that's something that we should make a kind of sine qua non for a relationship with any future government in Minsk. And I guess the last lesson that I want to draw is about treating Lukashenko's maneuvers with extreme suspicion. Again, a point that I think that David underlined. I mean, for the Americans in the audience, Lukashenko has been Lucy with the football and the West has been Charlie Brown, you know, and just as we're about to kick the football, Lukashenko always takes it away. There have been many occasions on which we have been convinced that this time Lukashenko was really going to make reforms, and we have relaunched our cooperation with the regime, including the Pompeo visit last year, and nothing has happened. In fact, things have tended to go backwards. So I think our working assumption has to be that nothing in Belarus is going to change substantially as long as Lukashenko remains in power, and that the West should absolutely not front load any kind of sanctions relief or any kind of political outreach to the regime. It's got to be a very slow process and backloaded so that the big rewards come for any new government, not for Lukashenko before he leaves power. And finally, two brief words of warning for the US and the UK. For Washington, I think it's important to be sensitive to the fact that Belarus has borders with 3 EU member states and that they may have their own important interests in issues such as nuclear safety or minority rights that may influence how far they feel able to go in putting pressure on Belarus. And I sometimes think Washington feels, you know, you can all go and hammer your neighbors. Sometimes it's not quite as simple as that. And lastly, a point for London. I think London needs to be realistic about its influence. It's true that we were able to adopt sanctions more quickly than the EU after we had left. But the fact is that the UK's economic relationship with Belarus is pretty insubstantial, while the EU is Belarus's second most important trading partner after Russia. So the EU has much more weight. Coordinated action will be much more effective than unilateral gestures. And I think I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. You've also mentioned many points both on the EU and the UK and as well the US. Can I just ask you, whilst you're still there, how united do you think the EU is actually on Belarus? Do its divisions on Russia spill over into policy on Belarus? You mentioned about obviously the interest of certain neighbor states, European neighbor states that Belarus borders with. But what about within the EU, larger EU, Hungary and other countries, do they come into play here?
I mean, in a sense, I think for most of them, Belarus is not so central or so important. And the problem over the adoption of EU sanctions really came down to Cyprus taking Belarus sanctions hostage in order to try and get sanctions imposed on Turkey, largely because Belarus didn't really matter to Cyprus. But it mattered to some others. I mean, in a sense, I'm not sure that I see Belarus as an area where there are huge active differences over policy. I mean, from that perspective, it is a bit different from Russia. But it is an area where, you know, there are a lot of countries for whom Belarus doesn't matter that much, and therefore, you know, they're not prepared to take very decisive action unless there is a really compelling reason to do so. And I think that's going to be you know, if you're looking at escalating measures against Belarus, I think that's probably a bit of a handicap. But I mean, I've been impressed by the way that, for example, the Baltic states have started to work together on Belarus in a way that sometimes in the past they had not.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Let's now move on to the questions. We've got already 4 questions. There are 2 questions on Russia. Will Belarus ever become a democratic country as long as Putin is in power? And the second question is, after last year's elections in August, it seemed that Russia would agree to a new leader like Babariko. But now Moscow seems to count on Lukashenko with a weaker role for him personally and a stronger role for his accomplices. I am always for dialogue and negotiations, but why do you think the West could reach anything at all talking to Moscow? Who would like to answer? Perhaps David and Ian, but Valerie and Tatsiana, if you also feel like answering, please go ahead.
Well, I'll just quickly say that I do think Putin is in a bit of an awkward spot when it comes to Belarus and Lukashenko. On the one hand, he does not like to see leaders forced out of power as a result of popular movements. He worries that that kind of thing could set an example for his own country. On the other hand, he can't stand Lukashenko, although they went snowmobiling when they last met in Sochi. And but if you look at the money he provided, what was it last fall, $1.5 billion, that's 10% of what he offered Yanukovych in Ukraine. Granted, Ukraine is 4 times as large, but still, there's not any love between Putin and Lukashenko here. But I think the problem is the Kremlin have not found someone they would be comfortable with and feel would be secure replacing Lukashenko. So for the time being, a weakened Lukashenko might be their preferred option.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I mean, as we've seen in the case of Syria, you know, you don't have to like the local leader that you're propping up. You just have to be sure that you have enough leverage over them that they will stay loyal to you. And so I think, you know, if I had been Lukashenko, I might have been quite nervous standing on top of a mountain with Putin in case, you know, I happened to have an unfortunate slip. But fundamentally, I think it probably suits Russia to have a somewhat weakened and dependent Lukashenko. You know, one who, for the time being, is pretty much precluded from making one of his habitual zigzags towards the West. and let the longer term take care of itself. Russia's got plenty of time probably to identify a potential successor, as indeed in the case of Putin himself.
May I jump in?
Yes, yeah, of course.
I just have one small comment, which makes probably the life of democratic forces in Belarus more complicated when it comes to Russia, is that any democratic forces, any democratic leader is perceived by Russia as a pro-Western leader. So it doesn't matter what he or she says about Russia, but in principle, Russia today is so concerned about possible democratic changes in Belarus that they perceive any democratic leader as pro-Western. And today we have a great saying of Russian ambassador about situation in Belarus, and he mentioned that whatever opposition or democratic forces say, they are pro-Western, and I think it creates a kind of a great challenge.
And if I may add to this, it seems to be a default position, especially in the European Union. So in order to have Belarus a democratic state, you first need to resolve the issue of Russia. So kind of like, whether you like it or not, kind of first we have to go and bow to Russia and sort of have the approval of any actions. But at the same time, Russia is very vulnerable on Belarus. It is very vulnerable because it has invested only in Lukashenko for more than 2 decades. And now, when it came to kind of Lukashenko being unruly completely, they don't have any presence in Belarus other than Lukashenko. No political parties, no movements, no serious NGOs, no analysts that would be like serious and authoritative analysts. They don't have any presence, essentially. And this could probably be the case also in Ukraine, but probably to a different extent. But Russia is in a very complex situation too. So they would like to break out of this dilemma, because Lukashenko is an illegitimate Lukashenko is a very bad option for Russia, because they cannot sign any agreements with him. They cannot purchase any enterprises. They cannot advance their interests in Syria in the long-term kind of standing. So, and this is our message too, to the United States, to the European Union, to the UK. Please signal to Russia in a very direct language that they cannot abuse the weakness of Lukashenko now to strengthen control over the situation. Because all these agreements, all these purchases, they will be revised, or they will be disputed. And this also goes not only to Russia, to any other nation, to any other state that would like to abuse the situation. They have to be mindful that these agreements might be revised in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Valery, for your last comments. Let's take one more question on Russia. If Belarus moves towards democracy, Russia might intervene to prevent change. What sticks and carrots can the West use in order to persuade Russia to keep out of the country?
I'll weigh in maybe initially, and others can jump in. I think for the West, the issue would have to be how many more countries does Putin need to invade before we actually sanction Mr. Putin himself? And I think we have to make it critically clear that a third violation of another country's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity could lead to actions on SWIFT. I know that is a big uphill battle, but expelling Belarus from SWIFT, that would not have the same impact as, say, expelling Russia from SWIFT. That would be a challenge to get support for that. But I think what we need to do now is to make it clear what the consequences would be for such an action, rather than react to it after it happens, to warn Mr. Putin off of any such possibility that he might be considering. Instead, I actually think what we should be doing, and I think will fall on deaf ears, I'm not naive in saying this, but the favor that Russia could engender if it supported a democratic election in Belarus would be huge. But instead, because that does not serve Mr. Putin's interests, he would prefer to have a grossly illegitimate, unpopular leader stay in Minsk, at least for the time being. So imagine if the Kremlin embraced the notion of actual, true, genuine, free and fair democratic elections in other countries, but that won't happen because then the same demand might be made by Russians in their own country.
If I might add to this, Belarus is experiencing a very profound political crisis, and it is not being resolved. Lukashenko is doing nothing to resolve this. Actually, it exacerbates this crisis in Belarus through using violence and without kind of resorting to any kind of dialogue. But Belarusians will be looking for the response, and they will be looking for help and support within the countries who want to support, who want to help resolve this crisis. So Russia can be part of the solution, or it can be outside the solution. They want, if they want, they can have a conversation with us directly with democratic forces. They can be part of the equation of the international mediation under the OSCE auspices, for example. We welcome this, we want this, and we think that Russia can play a constructive role in finding the solution. Again, they can be part of the solution or they can be outside this, but it is impossible it seems to be impossible at the moment to stop this protest movement in Belarus because people are so fed up with Lukashenko. They want the change, and this change is purely about internal processes. It doesn't have any geopolitical implications for Russia.
Okay, thank you, Valery. Let's move on a bit to the domestic dynamic in Belarus, to the internal dynamic. We have a question about the political role of the business community in Belarus today. Mr. Tsepkala and Mr. Babarika were prominent last year, but where do business leaders stand today? Well, we obviously heard from Lukashenko personally at the All Belarusian Assembly that he had ordered to close down 240 restaurants and other service businesses after they went on strike. We know about restrictive amendments being planned against self-employed people. Tatsiana, would you like to comment more, or Valery, what could you say about the business community and how much are they driving the changes in Belarus today, the protest movement?
I started, maybe Valery will continue. When it comes to this small and medium-sized enterprises, we saw that it definitely became a kind of a social economic ground for protest and for this pro-democratic movement in Belarus. When we look at this, social base of the protest, we see that a lot of people who own their small businesses or have some small enterprises, they participated in the protest actively. However, we should also take into consideration that this small and medium size enterprises, they were severely repressed by authorities. So I think that the answer is that they still are pro-democratic, they still support this protest mood and protest activities. However, it's really questionable whether they will come on the streets again because of the level of repressions. From the pro-democratic point of view, we do hope that they will come on the street. However, when we try to discuss this issue, we should take into consideration the unprecedented level of repressions. So it's really difficult to expect or to demand from the people when we are abroad to demand Belarusians to come on the street, because it's physically dangerous for them. I will answer like that. This business sphere and private enterprise and private sector is still supportive towards the democratic forces. However, they have suffered a lot. A lot of people have just to leave the country. We have a lot of businessmen who just relocated themselves. Today we need maybe additional support from the West in order to provide some assistance to these businessmen and to these small and medium-sized enterprises.
I can only add to this that businesses have never been the driving force of the protests in Belarus. They have been sympathetic. They have been sort of interested in this. They have provided some kind of support, but it was very small and it was mostly symbolic. But they have never driven or organized or arranged the protests in general. However, they came because of their loyal or sympathetic position to the protest. They came under the threat, which is existential. to businesses, because businesses have been essentially destroyed or forced to relocate to other countries. And in this case, kind of what we have here is a very interesting kind of comparison, because essentially we have to deal with internal sanctions of the regime against its own people, against own businesses. Like up to 500 businesses have been closed since August, and the government doesn't care about the well-being of people, jobs lost, or kind of the taxes that have never been paid to the budget. This is compared to the position of the Western governments sometimes, who care more about the well-being of Belarusians than the Belarusian government itself. Just to sort of strike this contrast between two approaches.
Well, thank you, Valery. We've almost run out of time. Our discussion is coming to an end. I would like to give the floor to each of our four excellent speakers today to make two concluding remarks, two concluding sentences, one remark. Please, Tatsiana, we can start with you maybe.
Yeah, I would like probably to mention the importance of support of civil society in the current situation, and of support of all this, track of people-to-people contacts when it comes to support, which is heavily needed to Belarus. There was a question about Eastern Partnership Program, and I think that within this Eastern Partnership Program, what we should develop and what we could develop basically is this cooperation on the level of civil society, and also on the track of people-to-people contacts. And this idea of visa facilitation and this promise of visa-free regime for Belarusians, I think is a great carrot which could be provided to Belarusian society.
Thank you, Tatsiana. We move on, Valery, to you, please. Your concluding remarks.
Thank you. So I would like to speak about the external pressure point, and the response from the international community has been sort of strong, but not effective enough. It seems it hasn't changed the behavior within the country. The situation continues to get worse. At the same time, it seems that Western governments are sort of coming around at this by this point. They are thinking about stronger measures, more practical measures. And I think it will all form into a very nice package of pressure on Lukashenko, forcing him to kind of recognize the reality that the crisis needs to be resolved. What's important here is that this position, these policies, they stay consistent. That the governments who have adopted these policies and launched themselves on this road, that they stay consistent with their own policies and do not kind of yield to the pressure or to the lures from the Belarusian government.
Okay, thank you. So people-to-people context from Tatsiana, consistency from Valery. Ian, please, can we move on to you now for your concluding remark?
Yeah, well, that last comment by Valery, I think, is extremely important. I was going to say, a lesson that I didn't mention was that in 1997, the EU said that it would only recognize the Supreme Soviet dissolved by Lukashenko as legitimate in Belarus. Shortly afterwards, it dropped that position. I think if we are going to say that we recognize Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the victor in last year's election, then we have to draw certain consequences by that, and we have to stick to them. And I hope that whatever else, the EU remains consistent in the positions that it takes, and that has to spill over to the Eastern Partnership funding as well. It has to mean that the EU then reviews how it's spending that money, so that it is not being spent in ways that support parts of the Lukashenko apparatus, which has been the case in the past.
Yeah, that's very important, Ian. Thank you. David, can we move on to your concluding remarks, please?
Sure, Katya. Look, I would say that at a time when democracy, freedom, and human rights around the world are under attack, and we saw this in Freedom House's report issued last week, Freedom of the World, 15 consecutive years of decline. I have to say that the people of Belarus have been an absolute inspiration to those who are struggling around the world people to live in better conditions. And so they deserve our support, not just moral, not just political, but economic and everything else we can provide. But I just want to salute the brave people of Belarus who have been going out in the streets. I know things have quieted down lately. I expect they will heat up again. And I certainly hope that they will get a better, brighter future in the very near future.
Well, thank you so much, David. I'm sure your words are very important, and I know there are people from Belarus who are tuning into this seminar, and they're very grateful to hear these words. Well, on this inspirational note, let me please conclude our seminar. Thank you so much for joining us today. My thanks go to our excellent speakers, as well, of course, to you, our audience. Thank you for your questions and listening. If you're interested to read more of our analysis, please follow us on Twitter at CEPA, find us on Facebook, or go to the website cepa.org. Thank you and goodbye.